In the heart of the desert, a murder has been committed, but it's not just the victim that holds a secret. The killer is among us, hiding in plain sight. Can Parker Pyne uncover the truth before the desert's deadly silence claims another victim? The night in the desert was as still as death itself, a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. The air was dry, thick with the scent of the desert, the endless dunes stretching into the unknown. Above, the stars shimmered like scattered diamonds, and the towering cliffs around them seemed to stand as ancient sentinels, watching over the group of travelers who had gathered around the fire. Their faces flickered in the dim light, each one marked by a shadow of something unsaid, something hidden. Parker Pyne sat apart from the others, his sharp eyes taking in the slightest movement, his mind working faster than anyone could guess. He wasn't part of the conversation, but he was always listening. The topic at hand was the Nabateans, ancient traders who had once ruled these lands. The conversation seemed innocent enough at first, filled with facts and theories, but Pyne knew better. There was a tension in the air, something beneath the surface that had nothing to do with the history they were discussing. Carol Blundell, her beauty untouched by the desert's harshness, fidgeted with her pearl earrings. They were exquisite, the kind of jewels that told the world of her father's immense wealth, the kind that had the power to buy silence, loyalty, anything. But as she turned her head slightly to catch the light of the flames, something caught her attention. One of the pearls was loose. She instinctively touched it, feeling an unease coil inside her. It wasn't just the pearl that made her uneasy. It was the conversation. The words being spoken, the subtle hints about wealth and power, seemed to slip past the others like secrets. The firelight cast shadows on her face, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. Her grip tightening on the earring as if trying to hold on to something, perhaps to the fleeting illusion of safety her wealth provided. Around her, the group continued to talk, unaware of the growing tension. The conversation had shifted to the nature of wealth itself. How much could you trust a man who had it? How easily could someone with nothing take what they wanted from someone who had everything? It was in those moments that Pyne noticed it, the way the others interacted too carefully, too calculated. They were playing a game, but no one knew the rules. And then, without warning, the earring was gone. The next morning, when the group made their way to the plateau above Petra, the mood had already shifted. The ancient city spread out before them, a sprawling ruin that once had been a thriving metropolis of wealth and trade. But here, in the stillness of the desert morning, something far more valuable had disappeared. Carol was frantic. Her voice shook as she insisted the earring had been securely fastened when they arrived. But there it was nowhere to be found, not in her tent, not by the rocks, not even near the ruins they'd been exploring. The group began to scatter, each searching in their own way. But Pyne could see the tension had shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Everyone had a reason to look guilty now. Carol's lover, Jim Hurst, a man with a past that could never fully be erased, seemed unnervingly calm. Dr. Carver, the quiet archaeologist, was unnaturally quiet. And Colonel Dubosc, always the man in control, seemed to be avoiding eye contact. The group's frantic search soon turned into open accusations. Colonel Dubosc demanded to be searched, but the request, though ostensibly an attempt at transparency, only seemed to deepen the suspicion. And then Mr. Blundell, Carol's wealthy father, gave a look that sent a chill down everyone's spine, a look that spoke volumes, but no one dared ask him what it meant. The stakes were rising, but Pyne knew this wasn't just about a lost earring. It was about power. It was about secrets. It was about the fragile threads holding these people together and how quickly they could unravel. Someone here knows more than they're saying, Pyne murmured to himself, but his eyes never left the group. The earring was just the beginning. Then came the final piece to the puzzle. Carol, desperate to clear Jim's name, pulled Pyne aside. Her voice was low, almost trembling as she confessed her darkest fears. Her father's wealth, she revealed, was no longer what it seemed. The Blundells had always been rich,
but there were whispers about debts, about loss, about a legacy built on sand. The earring, the symbol of her family's wealth, might just be a part of something far more dangerous. A symbol of everything that was slipping away, and Carol was afraid that the group's suspicion wasn't just about theft. And with that, the firelight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert. The tension was unbearable now. Everyone had something to hide, and nothing, not the pearl, not the stolen jewelry, nor the trust they'd placed in each other, was safe. Cliffhanger ending. As the group regathered, their faces painted with suspicion and distrust, Pyne's sharp eyes flicked over them all. He hadn't said much yet, but he was watching closely. Something was about to break, and it wasn't just about the pearl anymore. It was about who was playing everyone, who was hiding their truth behind their wealth, their words, and their lies.
And as the desert winds began to howl, a single thought hung in the air, thick as the heat of the day. Who among them would be the first to crack? The sound of a distant cry echoed in the desert night. The plateau was breathtaking. Petra, once the jewel of the Nabateans, stretched out in all its ancient splendor below the group. The carved facades of temples and tombs stood as silent witnesses to the centuries that had passed, their stoic silence now broken only by the whispers of the travelers and the rustling wind. Yet, despite the beauty of the surroundings, there was an unease in the air, thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't the dusty earth beneath their feet or the long shadows cast by the setting sun. It was something far more unsettling: the disappearance of the pearl. Carol, her eyes darting nervously from person to person, couldn't hide the tension in her voice. It was here. She insisted again, her fingers fumbling over her ear where the pearl earring should have been. I saw it when we first arrived. I remember checking it. It was secure. Her words faltered as she searched the ground around her, her gaze wild, as if the earring might materialize out of thin air. But the earth was stubbornly empty, as though it had swallowed the pearl whole. Dr. Carver, who had been quietly observing from the side, cleared his throat. "It's gone," he said in a low, measured voice, though there was an edge of tension beneath his calm demeanor. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and bent down to examine the ground more closely, though everyone could see his face tighten in uncertainty. No sign of it anywhere. A sinking feeling spread through the group. How could something so valuable just vanish like this? The earring, a symbol of wealth and status, was more than just a trinket to Carol. It was her link to her father's legacy, her place in a world she had carefully built around herself, and now it was gone. Carol shook her head in disbelief, her chest tightening as she bent down to search beside him. It couldn't have just disappeared, she muttered, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. "I had it. I know I had it when we got here." The group gathered around, their faces clouded with suspicion. Each of them had their own thoughts swirling, their own reasons to feel uneasy. Parker Pyne, the quiet observer, watched as they exchanged nervous glances, his mind piecing together the subtle shifts in their body language. The trust among them had already begun to fray at the edges. Now, the missing pearl, was a catalyst. It had turned their once casual exploration into something much darker. "I'll search the area," Colonel Dubosc said brusquely, his voice a little too firm, as if trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. He scanned the rocky plateau, his military-trained eyes seeking every nook and cranny. But there was something in his posture too rigid, too calculated, that set Pyne's senses on edge. Was he hiding something? Or was he simply trying too hard to appear innocent? The group split up, each taking their own section of the plateau to search. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long, sinister shadows over the ruins. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow passages, and the atmosphere grew heavier. The silence between them was filled with unspoken thoughts, each person wondering if the others were keeping something from them. Carol, frantic now, moved in circles,
her feet kicking up dust as she combed through the rocks. Every now and then she would stop, drop to her knees, and sift through the dirt with her hands, as though she could somehow force the pearl to reappear. But the more she searched, the more she seemed to realize this wasn't a simple mistake. The pearl was gone, and no one knew why or how. Jim Hurst, Carol's lover, stood off to the side, his face an unreadable mask. His pasta life of crime and deception cast a shadow over his every move. He looked over the ruins with a detached air, his eyes flickering from one person to another as if weighing the possibility that someone was playing a much larger game. Could he be the thief? Or was he, too, the victim of someone else's scheme? Pyne studied him carefully. There was something off about the way Jim avoided direct eye contact, a subtle shift in his posture whenever someone mentioned the word theft. "Do you think someone took it?" Carol asked him, her voice almost pleading. She was desperate, caught between the fear of losing her prized possession and the darker thought that someone in the group might be betraying her. "I don't know," Jim said quietly, his voice low, as if the mere mention of the earring was enough to unsettle him. "But I'll help you search. No one's leaving until we find it." But even as they searched, Pyne could see it. There was something more going on here. A missing pearl wasn't the only thing that had vanished. Trust, that fragile thing they had all once held, had started to slip away piece by piece. The group that had started out as curious travelers now stood divided, each person suspicious of the others. And no one knew who to trust anymore. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting a dark veil over Petra. The last rays of light seemed to drain away with the last shred of hope they had of finding the pearl. The group stood, weary and frustrated, each person holding their own doubts and secrets. Parker Pyne stood apart, watching the others, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips as he pieced the puzzle together. This was no ordinary theft. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that would reveal the darkest truths of all. But what were they hiding? And who would be the first to crack under the pressure? As the night settled in and the wind howled around them, Pyne could feel it a shift in the air, an electric charge that foretold something far worse than a missing pearl. And just before the last of the daylight faded completely, a soft sound pierced the air, faint but unmistakable. A single footstep, a shadow moved among the ruins. Cliffhanger ending. The sound of the footstep came from the direction where no one had been searching, too far for anyone to have wandered by mistake. Pyne's eyes flicked to the others, but no one seemed to have heard it, or perhaps they were pretending they hadn't. The question now hung in the air like an unsolved riddle. Who was it? Who was hiding, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? And with that final, eerie silence, the search was about to take a darker turn.
Rising tension. The atmosphere in the plateau had thickened, heavy with suspicion. The sun had long set, and the cool desert air seemed to amplify the sense of unease that hung over the group. Colonel Dubosc's voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "I demand to be searched," he said, standing tall, his jaw clenched. His eyes darted around, and for a moment, his calm composure cracked, revealing the hint of panic he had been trying to conceal. "To prove my innocence," he added, though the weight of his words felt almost like a challenge to the others. His demeanor suggested something deeper, a desperation to clear his name that came across as far too urgent. The group stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Colonel Dubosc was a man of honor, with a reputation built on discipline and integrity. Yet, here he was, throwing his own credibility into question, demanding to be searched with nothing more than an accusation hanging in the air. It was a move no one had expected, and it did little to settle the growing tension. Mr. Blundell, usually composed but visibly shaken, nodded in agreement. "I think we should," he said with a nod, his voice low and measured. But the strange thing, Washi didn't explain why. He didn't offer any reason, didn't show any sign of suspicion. He simply agreed. and that left the others wondering, why was he so quick to comply? It was as if something more was at play, a hidden motive, or a carefully crafted diversion. The silence that followed his words stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Every eye in the group turned to Mr. Blundell, each person wondering what he knew or feared that he wasn't saying. The search was swift and thorough, but nothing unusual turned up. Colonel Dubosc stood there, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the others, waiting for someone to make a move. Everyone was beginning to question themselves, their motives, their alibis. The trust that had once bound them together was quickly unraveling, and suspicion was now a silent, palpable force in the air. Then, as the last of the group returned from their searches, all eyes fell upon Jim Hurst. His face, usually so unreadable, betrayed a flicker of tension, something dark hiding just beneath the surface. Carol's lover and a reformed thief, Jim had always been a man with a murky past, and his presence in the group only served to amplify the distrust. "Jim," Colonel Dubosc's voice cut through the thick silence like a knife. "We need to talk. Your past is no secret." A cold, uncomfortable hush fell over the group as all eyes turned to Jim. He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of uncertainty. His fingers fidgeted nervously with his jacket, as if the weight of his past crimes was too heavy for him to bear in front of everyone. "What are you implying?" Carol's voice trembled, but her tone was sharp as she stepped in between them. She could feel the eyes of the group on her, but she refused to let the suspicion turn on Jim. "Jim has changed. He's not the man he used to be." But the look in Colonel Dubosc's eyes was cold and unforgiving. "Has he?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Or is he simply playing the part?" The accusation was clear, and it landed like a blow. Everyone stood silent, weighing the possibility that someone in their midst could be guilty, someone they had trusted, perhaps even unknowingly. Carol, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on her, turned to Pyne. She knew he was their best hope. "Parker, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "I need your help. Jim, he didn't do this." Mystery unfolds. Parker Pyne, who had been watching the entire exchange with his usual quiet intensity, finally spoke. His voice was calm, his words measured. "I will help you, Carol," he said, his gaze never leaving Jim's tense figure. "But we must tread carefully. The truth has a way of hiding in the most unexpected places." The tension that had built up between the group now coalesced around Pyne, who stood as the only one untouched by the suspicion that had begun to consume everyone else. His experience as an observer, someone who saw beneath the surface, was precisely what was needed to unravel this tangled web. As Carol and Pyne walked away from the group, Carol's voice trembled with both fear and determination. "My father's wealth," she murmured, more to herself than to Pyne. "It's always been a point of conversation. I've heard people talk. The rumors, the secrets." Her words trailed off, her face pale in the dim light. Pyne raised an eyebrow, his mind already spinning with the implications of her words. "What rumors?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Carol's eyes shifted, her gaze flickering to the group, then back to Pyne. "Here is something about my father's business dealings. I've never been sure what to believe, but I have a feeling he might be involved in this. I don't know why, but I feel it." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What if he's been hiding something? What if this is all connected?" Pyne considered this. The wealth of Carol's father had been a topic of much discussion among the group, and the strange unease about the pearl, the focus on material wealth, and the underlying tension all pointed to one thing. The truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined. "If you suspect your father is involved," Pyne said, his voice steady, "then we must be very careful. This is no longer just about a missing pearl. This is about something far more dangerous." Cliffhanger ending. Carol nodded, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. But as they walked back toward the group, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. From the corner of her eye, she saw Colonel Dubosc standing apart, his back turned to the others, but his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. In one hand, a small object gleamed under the moonlight, something that looked suspiciously like the missing pearl. Cliffhanger. Carol's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the colonel, her heart pounding in her chest. Had he found the pearl, or was he hiding something even more sinister? The group was already on edge, but now, the question lingered in the air: is the colonel the thief? Or is there something darker at play? The truth, it seemed, was slipping further away with every passing moment.
The first twist. Inside Pyne's tent, the flickering light of a single lantern cast long shadows on the canvas walls. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, maps, and the faint scent of ink from scattered notes that lined the small wooden table in the center. Pyne sat with his back to the entrance, his posture rigid and composed, as he studied the man across from him, Dr. Carver, his face pale, eyes twitching nervously. Outside, the sounds of the desert wind sweeping across the plateau seemed to fade away, leaving only the heavy silence between them. The tent felt colder now, a sense of unease settling in the small space like a physical presence. Pyne had known something was amiss. It wasn't just the pearl or the peculiar behavior of the group. It was the subtle tremors in Carver's voice whenever the subject of wealth came up. The uneasy glances exchanged between him and the others, and now here they were, face to face in this quiet tent, where the truth was almost within reach. Pyne leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Carver, who was now pacing back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. The doctor's normally confident demeanor had dissolved, replaced by a man on the verge of cracking under pressure. "Discovery. Dr. Carver," Pyne began, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of unspoken understanding. "I think it's time we spoke honestly." Carver's steps faltered. He paused, wiping his sweating palms on his trousers, then slowly turned to face Pyne. His eyes were filled with guilt and fearful emotions that Pyne knew all too well. Just tell me the truth," Pyne continued, his tone unyielding but not unkind. "You took the pearl, didn't you?" For a moment, Carver said nothing. His throat worked as if he were trying to swallow the words that caught in his chest. But then, he slumped, as if the weight of his actions had finally become too much to bear. "I did," he whispered, the words coming out in a broken exhale. "I took it. But it wasn't supposed to go this far." Pyne sat still, his mind processing Carver's confession. "You planned to sell it, I assume?" he asked, though it was more a statement than a question. Carver nodded, his eyes not meeting Pyne's. "Yes, I was going to sell it, but not for just any reason. He stopped, his breath hitching. "I needed the money. I've been struggling, funding an archaeological expedition for years, and I thought if I could sell that pearl, I could finally make it happen. The funds would have set me up. I'd have been free." Pyne's sharp gaze never wavered. "And you used the discussion about wealth and deceit to your advantage. The pearl was the perfect tool, wasn't it? A symbol of everything we've all been talking about. Deception, power, and illusion." Carver shifted uncomfortably, clearly unable to meet Pyne's gaze. Yes, it was too tempting. The pearl seemed like the perfect opportunity. "I knew the group would be too distracted by the talk of wealth, too busy pointing fingers at each other. No one would suspect me." His voice faltered, cracking as the weight of his admission settled over him. I thought I could get away with it. But when I lost it, when it disappeared, I couldn't even explain it to myself." Shocking realization. Pyne's gaze hardened, his voice cutting through the air with chilling precision. "The pearl isn't worth a thing, is it?" Carver froze, his face draining of color. What are you talking about?" he stammered, suddenly defensive. Pyne's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You didn't know, did you? Mr. Blundell's fortune is a house of cards, Doctor. The pearl. It's nothing but a worthless trinket. Mr. Blundell's wealth has been steadily eroding. That pearl, it holds no value. It was never meant to. Carver's face twisted in disbelief. But I thought. No, Pyne interrupted, his voice firm. You were deceived, and you've deceived yourself. You didn't take the pearl for the money. It was about something else, wasn't it? It was about the illusion. The power that wealth gives people, the way it controls them. That's what you were after, Doctor. Not the pearl itself, but what it could make people believe about you. Carver recoiled as if Pyne had struck him, his shoulders hunched in a mixture of shame and frustration. Didn't think it would end like this. I never thought. Twist. Pyne stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the documents on the table, his mind racing with the implications of what Carver had just revealed. The doctor hadn't stolen the pearl out of greed. Not truly. He'd stolen it to create a narrative, to craft an image of himself as someone who had control over wealth, someone with power. But in the process, he had become a pawn in a much larger game, one he didn't fully understand. And then, the most chilling realization struck Pyne: something far more dangerous was at play. Carver wasn't the only one with an agenda. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Pyne was about to continue his line of questioning, the flap of the tent rustled. There was a soft thud on the ground, then the faintest shuffle of footsteps outside. Pyne's hand instinctively reached for the small revolver hidden beneath his jacket, his senses on high alert. He turned to Carver, his expression now one of cold calculation. The group isn't the only one with secrets, Doctor, Pyne muttered, his voice a low warning. Carver looked at him, confusion clouding his features. What do you mean? Before Pyne could respond, the lantern flickered and died, plunging the tent into darkness. Outside, the desert wind howled. The silence was broken by a sudden crash, a sharp noise from outside the tent, followed by a muffled voice calling out a voice that sounded eerily familiar. And in that moment, Pyne realized that the true game was only just beginning.
Cliffhanger. The voice outside the tent, it was Mr. Blundell. But why was he here? And what had happened to him? As the darkness pressed in, Pyne and Carver stood frozen, caught between the secrets they had uncovered, and the one still lurking in the shadows. The stillness in the tent deepened as Pyne's voice cut through the tension like a razor. His words were slow, deliberate, but carried a weight that seemed to freeze the air between them. You didn't know, did you, Doctor? Pyne said, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer to Carver. The doctor, still trembling with guilt, met his gaze, though the spark of defiance in his eyes had already begun to waver. The pearl, it's worthless. Carver's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Pyne's expression remained unreadable as he let the words hang in the air. He didn't need to elaborate. Carver had spent years chasing a false narrative, believing that the pearl was a key to unlocking some form of power. But now, Pyne's revelation shattered the carefully built illusion. Mr. Blundell's fortune, the wealth Carver had hoped to manipulate, had been on the decline for months. The once flourishing empire was now barely hanging on, crippled by the economic slump that had swept through the region. The pearl, which Carver had so desperately sought, was nothing more than a trinket. A relic of a bygone era, with no inherent value. It was as though a cloud had been lifted from Carver's mind, the weight of his actions driven by a scheme based entirely on greed and illusion came crashing down on him with crushing force. He stumbled back, shaking his head, as if trying to deny the truth that now lay before him. No, that can't be, Carver whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. I thought it was worth everything, that it could be my ticket. Pyne stood tall, his demeanor calm and collected, but his gaze cutting through the doctor's despair like a blade. It was never about the money, Doctor, Not truly. You weren't after wealth. You were after something far more dangerous. Perception, control, power. Carver's face twisted, the stark realization hitting him with full force. He wasn't just a man driven by a desire for financial security, no. Carver had sought to manipulate the perception of wealth and influence. He had wanted to control how others saw him, to elevate himself in the eyes of the group by making them believe he was in possession of something valuable. The pearl wasn't about money. It was about power. Carver's pulse raced as his mind reeled. But I never meant for it to end like this. I only wanted to feel like I mattered. To be someone important. His words faltered as he looked down at the ground, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. I didn't think anyone would notice. Not really. Pyne's voice dropped to a chilling low, almost a whisper, as he regarded the doctor. That's the problem, isn't it, doctor? You never thought anyone would notice. You thought you could manipulate perceptions, make everyone believe you were someone you weren't. But you were always just a man with an illusion of power.
Twist. A tense silence followed, one that seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with a sense of finality. But just as the weight of Carver's failure began to sink in, something shifted in the atmosphere. A realization, more unsettling than anything before, crawled its way into the back of Pyne's mind. Something wasn't right. The pieces didn't quite fit. The situation was far more complex than it appeared. Carver wasn't the only one with a motive. Pyne's eyes darted across the tent, his sharp mind racing to piece together the details. The pearl, the theft, the strange behavior of the group, it all pointed to something larger. And as the realization struck him, Pyne's expression hardened. Carver hadn't been the only one attempting to manipulate perceptions. Someone else in the group was playing a much deeper game, and the stakes were far higher than anyone had imagined. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed from the entrance of the tent, followed by a voice, calm but heavy with intent. Mr. Pyne. It was Jim Hurst's voice, but there was something different about it. A coldness that hadn't been there before. Pyne's eyes snapped to the flap of the tent, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. He motioned to Carver to stay quiet, then slowly approached the entrance. "Just a moment," Pyne called out, his voice firm but measured. But before he could react, the flap was pulled aside with swift precision, revealing Jim standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was something unsettling about his stance, something guarded. Pyne's heart skipped a beat. This was not the man he had known. "I need to talk to you," Jim said, his voice low and urgent. "It's about the pearl, and it's about Blundell." Before Pyne could respond, Jim stepped inside the tent, his gaze flicking to Carver, then back to Pyne. "We're all in danger," Jim added, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the very words could betray them. The sudden weight of Jim's statement hung in the air like a threat. Pyne's mind spun, the puzzle pieces tumbling faster than he could catch them. The real game was still in motion. The pearl, the theft, the illusions, they were all part of something much more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The question now, who was pulling the strings? As the tent flap fluttered behind Jim, a chill swept through the room, and Pyne realized one terrifying truth: nothing was as it seemed. And the only thing certain in this tangled web of deceit was that things were about to get far worse. Cliffhanger. Pyne's gaze locked on Jim, his pulse quickening. The lines between friend and foe were blurring, and the stakes had just escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. Jim had just walked into the tent, but he wasn't the man Pyne thought he knew. And with one final, chilling sentence, the game was about to take an irreversible turn. The final act. Confrontation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the desert as the group gathered in a circle around the fire. The evening's air was cool, but the tension between them was suffocating. The events that had unfolded over the past few days had cracked the illusion they had all been living under now. The time had come to face the truth. Parker Pyne stood before them, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the circle. His sharp eyes swept over each person: Carol, her father, Jim, Dr. Carver, Colonel Dubosc, and the restand. For a moment, there was a palpable silence, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. The group waited, breathless, as Pyne began speaking in a calm but unwavering tone. "The truth is simple," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Carver's scheme to steal the pearl was never about the pearl. It was about power, about manipulation. He sought to use the pearl to create an illusion, to make all of you believe he was something he was not. But the pearl, Pyne held it up for all to see, is a trinket, worthless in itself. What matters is the game he was playing. Carver's eyes darted nervously, his face pale, and yet he could not escape the truth that Pyne had so carefully unraveled. His attempts to manipulate the group, to appear as if he were someone of value, crumbled before them. The pearl had only ever been a symbol of the facades each of them maintained. The uncomfortable truth was that, just like Carver, they all wore masks, each hiding their true selves behind layers of lies and deception. The loss of the pearl, once thought to be so valuable, had revealed that the greatest theft in this entire scenario wasn't the pearl, it was the loss of trust, the manipulation of each other, and the cruelty of pretending to be something they weren't. Emotional tension. As the dust settled from Pyne's revelations, Carol Blundell rose to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The firelight flickered across her face, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her. She turned to her father, her gaze cold and sharp. "Father," Carol's voice trembled but held an edge of determination. "I can't live like this anymore. You've controlled every part of my life, from who I marry to what I believe is right. You've used your wealth to buy everyone's loyalty, to manipulate their opinions of you. But I see you now. I see through it all." Her father, Mr. Blundell, looked up at her, his face unreadable, but a hint of worry flashed in his eyes. He had always believed his wealth could solve everything, could shape Carol's future. But now, for the first time, his daughter was questioning everything he had built. "You don't understand," he said, his voice calm but laced with a coldness that hinted at his control over her. "I've done all this for you, for your future. You'll thank me one day." Carol's hands clenched into fists. "No, Father, I can't thank you for destroying my happiness, for forcing me into a life I never asked for." She turned to Jim, her eyes softening. "I've been living in your shadow, your expectations, but now I choose to live for myself. I choose Jim." The words stung like a slap to her father's face, and for a moment he looked as though he might break. But instead, a cold smile crept across his face. "You think you can escape all this, Carol. You think Jim is the answer. The only thing you are doing is walking away from the truth, walking into a future as uncertain as the desert you stand on." Her heart ached, torn between the man she loved and the father who had held her captive for so long. But the decision was clear. She turned back to Jim, her eyes filled with love and defiance, as if to say, "I am not afraid anymore." The true culprit. As the tension between father and daughter continued to rise, Pyne's mind worked furiously. Something was still wrong. Something didn't add up. Despite Carver's confession, despite the pearl's inconsequential value, there was a deeper mystery lurking just beneath the surface, one that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with theft. As the group sat in stunned silence, Pyne's eyes flicked to the others: Colonel Dubosc, the enigmatic Jim, the anxious Dr. Carver. Every one of them had their own motivations, their own reasons for being there. But it wasn't the pearl that had driven them to deception. It was the very foundation on which their lives had been built: trust, loyalty, and the manipulation of truth itself. Pyne's voice broke the stillness. "The real theft here isn't the pearl. It's the way we've all manipulated each other, the way we've all tried to use each other for our own gain. Carver wasn't the only one playing a game. His gaze swept over the group, each person caught in their own web of lies. None of you are innocent. Not Carol, not her father, not Jim. Each of you had a hand in this charade, and now the question is, who truly benefits from this deception? The fire crackled in the silence that followed, the flickering flames casting long, ominous shadows across the faces of the group. They were all caught in a web of their own making, and the threads were about to unravel in ways none of them could have anticipated. Cliffhanger ending. And just as the air seemed to freeze, as if the weight of Pyne's words had settled in their hearts like a heavy stone, the ground beneath them trembled. A faint rumbling vibrated through the earth, and the distant sound of something moving something large reached their ears. Everyone turned instinctively, their faces full of fear and confusion. The sky above them darkened as a storm rolled in unexpectedly, the winds howling and carrying an eerie sound with them. From the darkness, a shadow appeared tall and menacing. The group watched in disbelief as a figure stepped into the firelight, their silhouette obscured by the dust and wind. "Mr. Pyne," the figure spoke, their voice deep and foreboding. "I believe there are a few more things you've yet to discover." The figure stepped forward, revealing a face they all knew, a face that would change everything. It was someone they least expected, someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Cliffhanger. The figure's identity would shake the group to their core, and Pyne knew that everything was about to spiral into chaos. The final revelation was imminent, but would they survive the storm of lies, betrayal, and revenge that awaited them? The climax. The sun had long since set, and the shadows of Petra's ancient ruins loomed large over the group, casting them in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The wind had picked up, sending dust swirling through the air, as though the very earth itself was unsettled by the unfolding drama. Each crack and crevice of the ruins seemed to whisper the secrets of centuries past, secrets that, like the group itself, had been buried, hidden from sight. In the midst of this grand, historical backdrop, the personal turmoil between the group was nearing its peak. The tension was palpable, the silence almost deafening. The night stretched on, the only sounds coming from the distant echoes of the desert and the occasional rustle of wind against the stone. The showdown. Parker Pyne stood motionless before them, his eyes scanning the group, each individual now a pawn in the complex game of illusion, trust, and deception they had all played. The once tranquil desert air felt charged, thick with anticipation. Pyne stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering as he addressed them all. "You see, the pearl is not the crux of this story," he said, holding the small trinket up for all to see. "It was never about wealth, nor was it about stealing. It was about something far more dangerous, the desire to appear valuable, to create a false narrative, a story of power and control. A story that each of you chose to live." The group stood frozen, their eyes locked on him as his words sank in. The realization hit them all at once. The pearl that they had overfought for held no real value. It had always been nothing more than an object, a symbol. Yet it had come to represent so much more: greed, deception, and the desperate need to control. Suddenly, Carol took a step forward, and with a trembling hand, Pyne placed the pearl back into her palm. Her fingers closed around it, but the weight of it felt different now. The pearl, once a symbol of her father's wealth and status, was now nothing more than an empty, hollow shell. The illusion of power shattered in her hand. But there was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness. Instead, there was a quiet understanding. She had been a pawn in a game much larger than she had ever realized, and now she was free. Resolution. The group waited for her reaction, and in that moment Carol looked at each of them, her eyes betraying a mixture of sadness and newfound clarity. The years of her life, carefully crafted by her father's wealth and expectations, now seemed distant and irrelevant. She had spent so long under the illusion of security that she had failed to see the truth. Wealth, status, and power had never been the answer. Without a word, she turned to Jim. He stood off to the side, his eyes filled with quiet hope. He had always been the one who saw her for who she truly was: beyond the pearls, beyond the riches. The decision had already been made, and in that moment Carol knew what she had to do. "I choose Jim," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong in its conviction. The words were a final, irreversible break from the past. Her father's control, his grip on her life, was now a distant memory. Mr. Blundell, the once mighty patriarch, stood in silence. His face, hard and stoic, betrayed nothing. But behind his eyes there was a flicker of frustration, of loss, and perhaps even regret. He had spent his life building a kingdom of wealth, but it was all for nothing. His daughter had chosen a different path, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. As Carol and Jim turned to leave, Pyne looked at the group one final time. His gaze lingered on each of them: the colonel, whose bravado had faltered in the face of truth; Dr. Carver, whose greed had led him down a path of self-destruction; and the others, who were still trapped in the web of their own making. And then, as quietly as he had come, Pyne began to walk away, his silhouette disappearing into the night. The group stood there, each of them alone with their thoughts, the weight of their actions pressing down upon them. The desert wind howled in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness they all now felt. Cliffhanger ending. But just as Pyne's figure disappeared into the ruins, a new sound emerged from the depths of the desert, a faint but unmistakable hum. It grew louder, more distinct. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the faintest glint of light flickered on the horizon. Pyne, still in motion, turned his head, his sharp eyes catching the strange movement in the distance. His instincts kicked in, and he knew something wasn't right. A figure emerged from the shadows of the desert, a figure they had all thought was long gone, someone who had been a part of their lives from the very beginning. Someone whose motives had remained hidden, their true intentions buried beneath layers of deceit. The question now lingered in the air like a heavy fog: who else had been playing the game all along? Cliffhanger. The figure's identity remained a mystery, but Pyne's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. The game was far from over, and the desert had yet to reveal all its secrets. The group's fractured relationships were just the beginning. What lay ahead could tear them apart even further.